This program is brought to you by Emory University.
It's a great joy to be here at Emory and to be welcomed by Mary Bullock. She didn't tell you that she was the head of our visiting board in our East Asian Studies at Harvard, as well as all the things she did for the National Academy of Science. And I was able to take part in some of the programs that she led, and she played a very key role in the early years of opening up. And I'll later talk about the science and technology, how important it was to Deng Xiaoping. When I was turning 70 and trying to think what I wanted to do when I grew up, I decided that I would leave teaching to younger, more lively people who really could devote themselves to their students. And I would try to do research on a topic that I thought was important. And as I thought about it, among the places that I've worked on, primarily China and Japan, but some of the smaller countries of East Asia, clearly the most important thing for Americans to know about is China. And I felt that I could make perhaps a contribution to trying to lay out how that formative period of China turning the corner and opening up, and if I could describe that period, that would help us understand what kind of place China is. Just as certain countries in certain formative period, say the United States under Madison and Jefferson, how we formed in that period, or say how Christianity formed at a critical period, I think Deng has played that same kind of role, where he played a very critical role in the formation of China, of the new China. Mao died in 1976, and he took over in 1978. I want to also express my appreciation while I'm here for Professor Steve Hockman, who helped me engage with the Carter Center, and to those connected with the Carter Center, who allowed me to spend a week going through their library and getting a lot of the materials, some of which will have played a role in the talk I give today. The first, let's see if I get the right button here. Oh, I think I got the wrong button. I'm going to go down to the next button. Is our person here? Let's try this. I just need to know which button, Emily. Hey, hi. Which button to go down to the next one? Oh, down here. Okay. Maybe let's try this one. No, that does. No, that's not. There we are. Push this one here. Okay, we'll change.
She also is just if you click that.
Oh, here we are. Okay. They say if you want to know about technology, you should ask somebody under 30, but now we have somebody under 10. So thank you very much. When Deng, the first picture we have of him is when he was 16 years old, and he'd just gone to France. And his trip to France, I think, played a very key role in establishing the background that Deng was able to make use of when he came to power in 1978. Mao had never been abroad before he came to power in 1949, and he didn't have a very good sense of what it took to catch up with other countries and how to deal with other countries. But Deng spent 5 years in France, from 1920 to 1925, and then at the end of that 25, he went to the Soviet Union, and from January 26 for a full 12 months he spent in the Soviet Union. So he had a great deal of experience in opening. He had a particular slant on things that turned him into a communist while he was in France. Already before he left China in 1920, he had become a very committed nationalist. He had reached adulthood just at the time when this May 1919, in the so-called May May 4th movement had turned out a lot of students, and it was really the birth of public nationalism in China. And Deng was only a high school student at that time in Guang'an County in Sichuan, but he took part in the demonstrations. And he was already very committed as a nationalist to trying to build up the country. And he went to France in the hope that he could help get some of the secrets of modern countries and bring those back to China. And in passing the exams, he had to study a lot and prove that he was very bright. And some leaders in China had the idea that since they couldn't get scholarships in those days like they do now, they would try to go abroad and have a work-study program, where they would work half-time and then study half-time. And they made this agreement during World War II. And the country they thought was the best country to study in at that time was France. It was considered a great civilization, and they had a great deal to learn. So a number of Chinese leaders, therefore, tried to help start this program to pick out some very talented young people and then send them to France. When they got to France, they found out that their expectations about getting a good job and earning enough money to study were unfortunately not to be realized. When they got to France, they found out that the French young men who had gone to war, who survived the war, were now back at work. And besides that, France was suffering from inflation and was also suffering from depression. And so the French workers had a very hard time finding jobs. And because they didn't have good labor union movements in those days, the rich people in France, who had wonderful homes that Deng and his friends could see, were living in a very fine lifestyle, while the French workers were slugging along in very difficult circumstances. And the Chinese were at the bottom of the heap. The jobs that the French workers did not want would go to foreign workers, and so they were at the bottom. And when they tried to think of what kind of explanation would make sense, and they started their own study groups, since they could not earn enough money to go to universities, they had to just work. And when they looked for explanations in their study groups, they found out that the Russian Revolution, which had just taken place several years before, was based on some theories that seemed to make sense and seemed to explain what they were observing. The capitalists exploit the workers, and the countries of advanced countries, what they call imperialist countries, were exploiting the other countries of the world, and that seemed to make a lot of sense. They also thought that they could have a tight organization. Lenin had led them to believe that if they have a good organization, they could really provide leadership. And they felt that China at that time needed a much stronger group in leadership, and that the Communist Party could provide that. So already as a very young man, Deng and others joined the Communist Party. If you look at this picture, these young communists don't look like they came just out of the gutters. In order to get enough money to get a good education to pass exams, you had to come from a family that was pretty well-to-do. And so they came mostly from merchant family or from landlord family, and they had been among the best and the brightest in China to be selected for this opportunity. In the early 1920s, there were about 2,500 Chinese studying in France. Nothing like the numbers that came to the United States after Deng really opened up after 78. But for that period, it was a very important group, more than the returned students from any other country. And in the 30s and 40s in the Civil War, this group did not necessarily play such an important role. But when China began to modernize a little bit in the 50s, and much more after Deng came to power in 78, these people were called upon to play a very important role because they knew more about the outside world in various fields. The leader of the group in Europe already was Zhou Enlai, who's right here in the middle of the picture, 6 years older than Deng. He was the one who became premier and foreign minister in charge of foreign affairs, who welcomed Kissinger and then Nixon to China. He remained a mentor for decades. At the far left is a man named Yang Zhenning, I'm sure Mary is familiar with, because he played such an important role in the scientific development, particularly in military science, and played a very key role. A couple to your right of Zhou Enlai was Li Fuchun, who played a very key role in the first 5-year plan and in the economic development of China. And then way back in the back row on a bench back there is Deng Xiaoping, who was one of the youngest in the group. Some people say he was 5 feet tall. Some people say he was really only 4 feet 11. But there is little Deng already very active in the Communist organization as a very young man. When Deng was working in China after 1949, after the communists came to power, for the first 3 years he was in charge of the Southwest Bureau and got experience in local administration. But then in 1952 he went to Beijing, and there, because it was the Cold War, the foreigners that he saw were mostly, of course, from the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, and other communist countries. And Mao already considered him as a potential successor, as a very bright young person who was very dedicated in dealing with the Soviet Union. Here's Mao's famous trip to the Soviet Union in 1957, Mao on your right and Deng Xiaoping on the left, showing that Deng was already playing a very important role in the communist world. Here's Deng welcoming Khrushchev in 1960. But Deng also was in Moscow. I'm sorry, this wasn't in Beijing, but Khrushchev was welcoming Deng in Moscow. But Deng was also there in 1956 at the 20th Party Congress. And at that Party Congress, Khrushchev gave such a devastating account of Stalin that anybody who had worked with Stalin was tarred and was difficult to regain authority. Nearly all the Soviet leaders had worked under Stalin and were thereby tarred, and that devastated the authority of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union. And Deng was already determined by that time, if China should ever criticize a leader, they should not have that same kind of devastating overall criticism that would make it difficult for the successors to have the authority necessary to do their work. Deng, of course, met a lot of other communist officials from other countries. Here he is with Ho Chi Minh of Vietnam. They had been in France at the same time. They hadn't really gotten to know each other then, but they came to know each other at a later time. In the early 60s, Mao was so furious at the Soviet Union that they exchanged a series of 9 letters between Moscow and Beijing that were devastatingly critical of the Soviet Union. Mao put Deng Xiaoping in charge of that. He had had a year study in Moscow already. He had proved that he could argue with Suslov and the others, and he's off to Moscow in 1963 for the last final big debate, sort of ending that period of hostile exchanges with the Soviet Union and making a pretty clean break. If you look at Deng at this period, you don't get the impression that he's suffering from an inferiority complex just because he's only 5 feet tall. When I interviewed President Carter about this, he said that some of the Soviet leaders tried to impress him with all they knew and to show off. But with Deng, he seemed to have an inner confidence so you could get down to business right away. And here are the other, some other leaders, Zhou Enlai right to left behind him, Peng Zhen, the head of the party in Beijing, Liu Shaoqi to his left, the chairman of the Communist Party, all of them, chairman of China, all of them very important leaders, and Deng is going off to be the head in argument with Suslov, and Mao was very proud of what Deng did in those arguments. Now, a few years later, however, after the Great Leap Forward began to fall apart, the Deng and Mao's relationship got worse. I think what Deng began to feel is that Mao did not correct for the errors of the Great Leap Forward, and that was devastating to the country and ruining the life of the people and leading to tens of millions of deaths. He knew that Mao was so powerful that in his presence, he and everybody else could only say positive things to Mao. But what he tried to do was distance himself from Mao and to have a little more independence in his own sphere by not going to Mao quite so often. At that time, Mao said, "Why is Deng always sitting in the back row and not paying much attention to what I say?" So by 1966, when Mao thought the revolution was not being pursued hard enough and that too many people were making compromises with the economic organization, he decided to push the Cultural Revolution, and the two biggest targets were two top leaders, Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping. So from 1966 to 1973, Deng was out of it. One, I think, positive benefit is that from 69 to 73, when he was down in Jiangxi, he had plenty of time to think about what he would do. One of my colleagues at Harvard, David Gergen, points out that a lot of the great leaders of the world who really made great changes, including Lincoln and Churchill and de Gaulle, had high positions, then fell and were outside for a long period of time. And while they were outside, they had an opportunity, he calls it the experience in the wilderness, the opportunity to think about long-range pictures and to be a little sure about the directions that they want to go, and sort of had time away from the hustle bustle of daily activity to gain broader perspective. So Deng in 1973 then comes back to Beijing, and under Mao's watchful eye. And at that time, the first time he came back was at a dinner that Zhou Enlai gave for Sihanouk. And here Deng is appearing for the first time in 7 years, acting as if nothing had ever happened, ready to go back to work. Zhou Enlai began to get cancer, we now know, by perhaps 72, but certainly by 73. And Mao also felt that Zhou Enlai was not pushing hard enough against the United States. The United States, he was a little too soft in dealing with Kissinger, and he was a little unhappy with him. So in 1973, after Deng came back, Mao began to use Deng to receive foreign visitors. First, he sat in on the meetings with Zhou, and then he put him in charge. So from 73 through the end of 75, he was really in charge of seeing foreign visitors, but under the tutelage of Zhou Enlai. This, I think, is a very poignant picture because Zhou Enlai had been responsible for foreign policy for so many years. And now, by 1974, China was given the chance of giving a major speech in the United Nations. Until 1971, the China seat in the United Nations was held by Taiwan, by Chiang Kai-shek and his son. And 1971, they switched it to the communist seat. And so Beijing began to prepare a major leader to go to the United Nations to give the first inaugural speech by a Chinese leader in the United Nations. Zhou Enlai, of course, because of his long service, deserved this. But here Zhou Enlai is at the airport seeing off the man that he was helping tutor and train and go to the United Nations in 1974, Deng Xiaoping. Here Deng is addressing the United Nations. Here he is up close. Here he is meeting Kissinger for the first time. Of course, in the early years, when Kissinger came to China in 71, 72, when Nixon came, Deng was off after the Cultural Revolution, as the euphemism they used. He was in the peach garden. He wasn't able to attend any of those meetings. So the first time Kissinger met Deng was 1974. Kissinger considers Zhou Enlai one of the two greatest statesmen he ever met, and was just an extraordinary leader. And when he first met Deng, what he said was, Deng seemed to be on a training mission. He didn't have any of the smooth, suave, sophisticated manner of Zhou Enlai, and he didn't have the breadth of knowledge that Zhou Enlai had about the entire world. I personally think that's a little unfair, because I think what Deng was so worried about when he went was what Mao would think. And he was on kind of tenterhooks with Mao at that time still. He'd just come back from the Cultural Revolution and criticized, and he felt he had to be very careful. So rather than express his own opinion, he yielded to the man at the left here, Chiao Guanhua, who was foreign minister. People who met Deng after he returned, after Mao's death, said he struck them as very confident, poised, knowledgeable, ready to talk about the entire world. But at this time, maybe he was partly on a training mission, just learning about foreign affairs. Then, at the end of 1975, Mao again thought Deng was going too far in trying to put the Cultural Revolution behind him, and he purged him again. And Mao, in 1976, the early part of 1976, decided that he would name as his successor Hua Guofeng. Hua Guofeng, some of my Chinese friends said he was like a tubaozi, a kind of country bumpkin who didn't really know what was going on. I think a more accurate term would be shengji ganbu. He was a provincial level person who had done pretty well as a provincial leader, followed Mao very closely, but did not have he'd never really met foreign visitors. He had no understanding of foreign relations, didn't know about foreign countries. He'd never been a military leader. And many people felt he was new to Beijing. He just did not have the breadth of perspective, the authority, and the ability to guide the country in a new era. So when Mao died in September 1976, Hua Guofeng assumed the mantle of the top leader. And then the question was, do you allow Deng to come back? And some of the leaders, particularly Marshal Yang Zhenning, the leading military guy, who became at that time the person who was really selecting the top leadership, the most important person, was convinced that Deng ought to come back. And so in August 1977, Deng was allowed to come back. And when he came back, he immediately was in charge of foreign affairs again. He played a major role in military affairs along with Marshal Yang Zhenning. But Deng also volunteered to be in charge of education, science, and technology. He felt that after Mao's death, they could really begin to modernize. And in preparation for that modernization, compared to all the other kinds of modernization in industry and agriculture and national defense, the most important to Deng was science, technology, education. And so immediately after he came back to work in 1977, he volunteered for that job, overseeing those areas, and he immediately called together the educators. It's hard for American university people to imagine a country that closed down universities for a whole decade. Some universities were barely open, but not really. China was not really functioning as a university system from 1966, the beginning of the Cultural Revolution, until 1977. And so for a whole year, universities were really out of it. Deng also felt that the way to select students for the university was strictly by entrance exam. Mao Zedong had always insisted that political considerations, whether a person is really read and dedicated to the party, should always be a major factor in selecting who should be allowed to study and go on for higher education. But Deng said we ought to have merit. So he came back, and within days after he started work, he already was able to assemble the education forum of leading educators, including the Minister of Education. He asked them, can we open universities this fall, and can we begin to have entrance examinations. And they gave him all the reasons why it was so difficult. There'd be about 7 million people take exams. They'd have to decide which subject. They'd have to write the questions. They would have to announce it and assemble people to give the examinations. They'd have to grade the examinations, open the university. Those of you who've been in university administration understand that that's a lot of work for educators to manage in such a short time. But the leaders, after they finished, Deng said to them, "Is it possible we might be able to do this year?" They said, "It is possible." He said, "We're going to do it." So in late '77, they had the examinations for 7 million people, selected students, and reopened the universities. One of the shortcuts for learning about the outside world, about science and technology for Deng, were the Chinese Americans. Because these people not only spoke Chinese, many of them had been in China in the late 40s, knew the situation in China. They were up on world-class levels of science and technology. And so Deng could very easily relate to them and ask them what they had done in science and education. And here he is. At that time, there were 3 Chinese Americans who were Nobel Prize winners. One was Yang Zhenning. Here is Deng with Yang Zhenning. One was Samuel Ting of MIT. Here's Samuel Ting. One was a pair, Li Zhengdao and Li Yuanzi. Here he is with them. In meeting these people, and he met them more than once, he met them several times over the next several years, the question always was, what can China do to catch up in modern science? And by making good use of these Chinese Americans, he was in very good positions. He also met a lot of other leaders in other fields. Here is Zhao Yanren of the famous linguist. The reason I show this picture, though, is because his daughter over here to the right was the Chinese language teacher at Harvard for many years. And there in 1960-61, Irwin Hyatt studied under her. And I was also in that same language class, studying from this lady who was one tough cookie of a language teacher. But it was a way of Deng keeping in track of major Chinese intellectuals, particularly science and technology. Of course, in my book, I give a lot of credit for Deng as the person who got things started in December 1978, really moving forward in the opening of the country. But I think it's hard to understand what he was able to do without understanding how ready the country was, how many officials, high officials, felt that China had made major mistakes in the Great Leap Forward in the Cultural Revolution. They needed a distinctly different start. But particularly in the summer of 1978, they sent abroad a number of missions to find out what was going on in the rest of the world. And the most famous of these was the Gumu mission in the summer of 1978. Gumu had been head of the construction commission. He had been part of the group that tried to keep the country running all during the Cultural Revolution. There was a small group that was allowed to not take part in the political struggles, but to try to keep the country, the economy, and the science going. And he was deputy premier with some of those responsibilities, with Li Xianyan, the father-in-law of someone who's at the Carter Center. So Gumu and his delegation of people selected young enough people who could still be in office for several years from various departments, from various important ministries connected with various parts of the economy, and they traveled to Switzerland, France, Germany, Holland, and Belgium for 5 weeks and got to see factories. They divided up into the various specialties, seeing different kinds of factories, mines, port facilities, scientific research centers, other civil institutions. And they came back and they were to give their report after these 5 weeks one afternoon. And the meeting that started 3 o'clock in the afternoon went on until midnight. And the people who attended that meeting say it really had a major impact on the change of the thinking of the top level leadership. They had been partly a victim of their own propaganda, telling how well China was doing and downplaying imperialism. And when they saw what was going on, they realized what Deng had already realized when he went to New York in '74 and stopped on France on the way back, that China was just way behind. They also carried the information that the European countries were ready to lend them money and to give them advice and help in learning about science and technology. So rather than be simply discouraged about how far they were behind, they came back really quite excited, and over the next few months, they almost got carried away with thinking of all the things that they could import, and they were ready to jump ahead almost too quickly. Here's Deng talking to Gumu. Now, in November of that year, just a few months after that visit, they were having a party work conference just before the third plenum, which was to open December '78, to try to talk about overall plans for the next year. Marshal Yang Zhenning, the kingmaker, and a group of others like Li Xianyan decided that Hua Guofeng was not up to the job. He was not doing well enough, and they needed to bring back Deng Xiaoping, who was the only one who had the experience. He was military leader for 12 years. He had foreign policy. He had been a regional leader in the Southwest for 3 years with 100 million people that he had been in charge of. He had been general secretary for over 10 years in Beijing. He had great knowledge. Some people say he didn't know that much about economics, but he was finance minister for a year in 53, 54. So Deng, who had this extraordinary range of experience, was then selected to become the top leader. However, the kingmakers recalled that in the Yan'an period, Mao had been quite open. He was willing to listen to people, but after '49, when he had all the top titles of party secretary and chairman of this and that, and everybody had to memorize sayings from Mao, that he no longer listened to other people, and that it was very difficult when terrible errors were made to get those in because of the overwhelming power of one person. It wasn't just Mao, it was the whole system and the people who protected him and taught about him. So they decided that Deng would not be given the top titles. He would still be called deputy premier and vice chairman. Not only was he not given all those titles, but another person who was about his experience and authority in the party was paired along with him. So here we are with Chen Yun, that other person, along with Deng Xiaoping, the two leaders. It was really a pair. Although Deng was the public spokesman, Chen Yun, who knew about economics and had enormous range of leadership experiences, was on the Politburo even before Deng was. They were to lead the country as a pair, so that Deng would not have the overweening authority that Mao did. 2 months before that third plenum, Deng made a trip to Japan. Earlier in '78, when it was clear they were going to start modernization, Deng realized that the two countries that they would need to rely on most for modernization help were Japan and the United States. So in October 1978, he goes to Japan. In 2,500 years, when Chinese had been meeting Japanese, the first time a high-level Chinese leader ever met the emperor was in October 1978, when Deng met the emperor. They talked for a couple hours over lunch. The emperor apologized for the horrors that they caused in World War II. Deng accepted the apology. Deng said they had very good conversations, and that provided a kind of underlying basis for the two countries to work together more closely over the next few years. The news of this was important to Deng, not just in Japan to get the help, but in China to get them to be willing to work and study under Japanese, who they had learned to hate since World War II, particularly since World War II. While in Japan, Deng visited many modern facilities, part of these were not just to show him, but the pictures were relayed to the Chinese public so that they could get a sense of how modern the facilities were, how willing the Japanese were to work with them. Here he is at the Kimitsu steel plant with Inuyama Yoshihiro, the head of the Shin-Nitetsu plant. This plant became the model for the first great modern steel plant in China, Baoshan. You may have seen the newspapers reporting that China now has more mileage of express trains than any other country in the world. But the first time a Chinese leader rode on one of those modern trains was when Deng was in Japan. For in October 1978, China had 0 mileage. Deng did not want to be accused of fawning on Japan, and yet he wanted to recognize what they had accomplished. So when they said, Deng, what do you think of, Mr. Vice Premier, what do you think of the experience? What do you think about that? He said, it's very fast. Here he is visiting Tanaka Kakue. He also, after that, in November 1978, visited Southeast Asia, and here he is meeting Lee Kuan Yew, the Prime Minister of Singapore. Lee Kuan Yew was born in 23, some 19 years after Deng was born, but he knew a lot about the world. When I was in graduate school, some people said, well, Chinese civilization does not fit with modernization. And the question they raise is, why cannot China modernize? And some people thought the culture did not permit modernization. But here was an example already where an ethnically Chinese community, 75% ethnically Chinese, Singapore, had already made very rapid progress in modernization. And that, of course, was very encouraging. And Deng and Lee Kuan Yew hit it off very well. When I met Lee Kuan Yew to ask him about Deng, he said he thought he was one of the most impressive leaders he ever met. And he certainly met a lot of leaders of many countries. He said Deng was willing to change something he grew up in, knew it was wrong, and turn it to a new way. In the fall of in August 77, after President Carter had come to office, he sent the Secretary of State to Beijing, but that visit did not go very well. And so in the spring of May 1978, he decided to send his national security advisor, and at that point, President Carter had determined that they could begin to negotiate on normalization. Although the visit of Nixon had opened the relations between China and the United States, there had always been various kind of problems where the details of the normalization agreement had not been completed. But Zbig was able to announce that we're going to move ahead and we're ready to begin those negotiations. Deng, by this time, of course, had been famous for hating the Soviet Union and was afraid the Soviet Union was getting too powerful, especially after the United States left Vietnam. And Zbig, whose father was a Polish diplomat, felt toward the Soviets like all Poles do. And so Deng and Zbig immediately hit it off as anti-Soviet. And Zbig immediately talked of all the things, good things about Deng. He said he was sharp, he was quick, we could get down to business. When he got home, President Carter wrote in his diary that Zbig seemed to be carried away, and he had to tease Zbig about being too soft on Deng. But President Carter was actually very happy with the progress that was made, and decided then to move ahead with normalization talks. So the person that President Carter had put in Beijing to be head of the liaison office, is kind of the working office before we had diplomatic relations, before we had an embassy. The person he put in charge was Leonard Woodcock. And the reason he put him there was because he was a great negotiator, and he wanted to have Woodcock negotiate the normalization. He was a person who was respected by the labor and by management even though he was a firm, dedicated negotiator. And he was also popular in Washington, so that any difficulties in getting congressional support for normalization would be much easier because Woodcock. Here they are toasting in December 1978. They just completed the normalization talks. A lot of the talks were conducted with this guy in the middle, Huang Hua, foreign minister, and Woodcock. But the final stages were conducted by Deng and Woodcock directly. When they asked Deng about somebody visiting the United States realized that Hua Guofeng was still officially the premier and still officially the party chairman, and so they thought it was a little awkward to ask Deng directly. So the way Woodcock put it to Deng when he met him was, we would like to invite a Chinese leader of your choosing to visit the United States to celebrate the normalization. And Deng said, yes, I'm ready to go. How about next month? And so in January, Deng was in the United States. In the middle, this guy, Chaozhu, who had gone to Harvard from 1948 to 50. I had the pleasure of showing him back to his room in Thayer Hall when he later came to visit there. Not only was a good interpreter and knew America very well, but he was also a very broad-gauged, politically wise person. He later became ambassador to Great Britain. So you see, they had quite good conversations. And President Carter said that the experience of having Deng was one of the most pleasant things that occurred during his term as president. Here they are in January. Here they are signing the normalization agreement. Deng felt that the person who negotiated who opened up China-American relations ought to receive some appreciation. And he said, there's a Chinese saying that when you drink water, you ought to remember the person who built the well. Of course, they weren't drinking water at this occasion. But he said Nixon played a very major role. How about inviting Nixon back to the White House? Nixon had not been back to the White House since he was escorted away after Watergate. But President Carter agreed to welcome him back. And so here is Nixon at the White House the first time after Watergate that he was allowed to return to the White House, having a good conversation with Deng Xiaoping. And they later went off, and Nixon and Deng later had a long private talk as well. Here is the messy Congress that we have learned to live with and love. Here is Deng Xiaoping, the little guy, in the middle of the picture. And to your left, there's that interpreter, Chaozhu. And then sitting down, there's a plump white-haired man who was Speaker of the House at that time, Tip O'Neill. And Tip O'Neill then went and had a long conversation with Deng Xiaoping. And Tip regaled him with stories of how Congress fought with the White House. And the two hit it off very well. And Deng invited him to China, and the next year Tip O'Neill accepted. But at the end of the conversation, when Tip O'Neill was stressing how important it is in a political system to have checks and balance, to have Congress that is different from the White House, Deng Xiaoping said it wouldn't work in China. He wanted a unified single party, not a division of labor. Here we are at Atlanta. Henry Ford II came down to show him the Ford plant here. And my title in Harvard is the Henry Ford II Professor of Social Sciences. I never got to meet Henry Ford II, but here Deng did get to meet him. While he was in Atlanta, Deng had a smart enough speechwriter to let him make a speech in which he said, After the horrors of devastation of Atlanta after the Civil War, the wise leaders in Atlanta went about rebuilding their city, and they're building up a modern place in the South that was then very backward. China is now very backward. We've been devastated, and we want to have the same kind of wisdom that you people in Atlanta had after the Civil War. Deng went from Atlanta to Texas. We're getting ready now for the most famous picture. This cowgirl rides up and hands Deng a cowboy hat. And here he is wearing the cowboy hat. To Americans, this conveyed the view that maybe he's a communist, but he's a pleasant guy you can deal with. He's human. But Orville Schell, a reporter, a China specialist who was here at the time, said that the picture had an even bigger impact in China because when he wore this and the picture was shown in China, it was a message that even though the United States had been considered imperialist for decades and was a horrible country, now somehow it's not so bad. You can begin to not only learn science and technology, begin to imbibe American way of life, and opened up the country. And so this picture became an important symbol for that opening in China. It happened in 1975 when Mao put Deng in fairly important responsibilities in directing things in the country. The person who was in charge of liaison office that year was George Bush Sr. And so the two of them bonded and became quite friendly. It's really quite remarkable to me how Deng was able to relate to so many different American people of different political parties and had the same kind of earthy, down, direct conversation, business, no nonsense, that made it very easy to get along with a lot of people. When Reagan was running for president, he talked about improving relations with Taiwan, and perhaps normalizing relations, which was very upsetting to Deng and other Chinese leaders. Bush Sr., I think, played a large role in getting over that. And here he is with Deng, sort of working out arrangements where we would limit sales of arms to Taiwan, which had been very upsetting. So that made it possible for Reagan to have a very successful visit to Beijing. And after that visit, Reagan said he didn't seem like a communist. In 1982, Deng met Maggie Thatcher. And she had initiated the visit, wanting to begin to talk about the problems of Hong Kong when the agreement on the lease of Hong Kong, the new territories, would run out in 1997. She had just won the Falkland War and was feeling quite confident, so that her Chinese her advisors on matters of China were rather diffident in the way they explained things. She was known, of course, as the Iron Lady. Deng was known sometimes as the Steel Factory. And so here you have the Iron Lady meeting the Steel Factory. And she thought at the time that it was still possible to work out an arrangement where even after the official return, the end of the lease in 1997, that British would be allowed to remain administrators of Hong Kong, provide the stability that would reassure the business community so Hong Kong could remain vital. Deng made it clear that that wasn't what he had in mind, that after that lease ran out in 1997, that China, thank you, would resume sovereignty and would carry out its own administration. However, he wanted to work in a cooperative way. After that, Maggie Thatcher was somewhat taken aback. On the way out of the building, she tripped on the steps of the building they were going on. That was filmed in Hong Kong and played and replayed to show that the Iron Lady had fallen she met the steel factory, who was even tougher than she was. In any case, the two countries then began negotiating, and 2 years later, they'd worked out an agreement where Hong Kong for 50 years would be allowed to keep its own system, its own way of ruling, be ruled by local people, and that the authority would be resumed by China. And here they are 2 years later, at the end of that, happily agreeing that they've now reached a satisfactory arrangement for the future of Hong Kong. Deng tried to get China in all kinds of international organizations. Here he is with McNamara, head of the World Bank, Rodeo of IMF. Some of you are probably old enough to remember in the ancient days before Wikipedia, we used to use things called encyclopedia. And Deng thought that the Encyclopedia Britannica was a great way to make lots of Western knowledge available in China. And here he is arranging with Frank Gibney for the translation of the Encyclopedia Britannica to be available in China. Here he is with various business people, just a sampling Hong Kong business people. Anwang, in those days, was one of the early computer companies. And of course, again, like the Nobel Prize winners, was a very useful way to give Deng a sense of what was required in a country to keep up with modern information systems. Here he is with George Bush again in February 1989. Over the 1980s, there were still a lot of problems that remained. The student movement had been very active in 1986. In 1988, there were still a lot of students who felt that the political commissars looking over them were butting into their private life and they wanted more freedom. And a lot of individuals ordinary citizens resented the specter of secret police and prying into all kinds of their affairs. In addition, in 1988, there was a huge inflation. And for those salaried workers who got a set salary at a time when the country was not rich and they were trying to make it into the middle class, the 30% or so inflation that occurred in 1988-89 was very upsetting. And so a lot of students and demonstrators were beginning to demonstrate in various places. Now, the reason the foreign press was invited to Beijing in the spring of '89 was because the Gorbachev and his wife's visit. As I pointed out before, in 1963, relations had been ended with Deng Xiaoping in Moscow. And then in the 1980s, Deng realized that to move ahead, it would be a mad mistake to be like the Soviet Union and spend so much on military when he had so many enemies. And so he wanted to form better relations with the Soviet Union and avoid risk. And he said that if the Soviet Union would just move troops back away from the border, our northern border, if they would pull out of Afghanistan, if they would get Vietnam to pull out of Cambodia, we could begin to improve and have regular relations with the Soviet Union. And Gorbachev in 1989 accepted Deng's terms and came to Beijing, and that's why reporters came to Beijing. But of course, what they were interested in was, when they got there, was the student movement. And because there had been so much resistance building up in 1988 and 1989, and the foreign press was there to cover it, here we have the goddess of democracy based on the Statue of Liberty and the tumultuous crowds at Tiananmen Square. On May 20th, 1989, Deng sent in troops unarmed and told them to restore order. But they were stopped by the public who blocked them with putting buses in the way and tanks in the way. And once they stopped, the crowds pulled out engines from the cars and took air out of the tires, punctured the tires, so they could not move forward, and so they were not able to establish order. Deng ordered the troops to go back to the outskirts. They built up their forces from all over China, and on June 3rd, Deng passed the order that the troops should have arms and do what was necessary to restore order. They announced that people should stay off the streets, and they first fired rubber pellets into the air, but when people continued to block, they shot, and a lot of people were killed. And we saw this on television, and all of us who saw it then realized what a horror that was of killing so many unarmed people in the streets of Beijing. Tim Brooke, a Canadian scholar who was there and did a lot of research on the number of deaths, estimates the number of deaths in the city somewhere around 700-800. Some people have estimated higher and lower. We don't know the exact figure, but it was somewhere in that range. Here, the tanks, famous picture, the tanks coming in and somebody standing in front trying to stop the tanks. Vice President Bush was by then president, and this should be dispatched by Bush, not Reagan, I don't know. Bush, who was then president, wrote a very touching letter to Deng just after June 4th. He said, the reason we are imposing sanctions is not because we're trying to destroy China. It's because the Americans have a great faith in democracy. We believe that's the best system of rule. We believe it's a more humane system for the people, and that it's become a great shock to us that people were killed on your streets, and that the political situation is such that I must impose sanctions. But it's been very difficult to get relations with China and the United States. We must find some way to continue relations. The relations between those two countries are just too important. I consider you, Deng, a special friend, and I would like to send a special delegate to Beijing to see if we can't find some way to keep relations. So we sent Brent Scowcroft. Here he is meeting Deng, trying to preserve the thread of relations over the next few years, even though there were sanctions. Deng said at the time that the sanctions will create difficulties, but within several years, businessmen from foreign countries will say, we need to find a way to get into the Chinese market. They will go to their governments, and the governments will begin to resume contacts with China. In the meantime, we should remain calm. The oceans were there before Tiananmen incident. They will be there afterwards. And this picture of Deng enjoying himself in the water was then circulated as a way to show that we should remain calm during this period. In 1992, Deng was already 88 years old. He finally was saying goodbye to the political stage. Here he is waving goodbye and supporting his successor. Here's a very poignant close-up of Deng. After he retired, he walked around his garden for 5 years, and in 1997 he passed away just before his 93rd birthday. 1904 to 1992. Here is the memorial service for Deng when he died in 1997. Here, Jiang Zemin is giving a funeral oration. And afterwards, the United Nations, where Deng had given the initial speech for China's initial taking over their responsibility in the United Nations, observed a moment of silence on his death. Thank you very much. Oh, eager.
That wonderful.
Not just willing, eager.
The floor is open, and Ezra, I'm just going to let you point on the people you want to.
Okay. John.
John Garver, Georgia Tech. So, Ezra, when did Deng Xiaoping decide that the Stalinist model, economic model that the CCP imposed on China in 1949-50, when did Deng Xiaoping decide that was a wacky model, that was not a good model? Was it a gradual process, or was there a moment of revelation?
We don't have any precise record. Deng did not keep notes. But when I interviewed his daughter said that during the early part of the Great Leap Forward, he realized the system it wasn't just Mao, it was the system. I personally think if you had to guess a date, I would guess mid-1959. The Great Leap Forward had already gone, and Mao was showing determination to keep it up again, even though in December 58 he might have been slowing down. Early 59 he was revving it up again. Deng was not only a bridge player, he was a pool player. And in late spring 1959, he was playing pool and broke his leg. And he slipped and fell down and broke his leg. So he was not able to attend the big party meetings where he would have had to denounce Peng Huai and join all those things. And I think that was a defining moment. And I can't prove it, but I think it is clear, there's enough in the record to show that it was during the first part of the Great Leap Forward when Mao was determined to push ahead despite the difficulties, that Deng was no longer able to stomach it. After all, Mao was kind of the big philosopher, historian behind the scenes, and Deng was on the front line. And when he was a soldier from 37 to 49, in a wartime, he always had to get ready for the next battle. He didn't have time to consider, what the ideology was. He wanted to, respond to the conditions. So that's my best guess, is it was the summer of 1959 was a major break, and that he had to go along after that because Mao was still in charge. But when he got a chance, he pulled back. Yes, sir.
Eric, it's Emory University. You had mentioned that at one point Deng had said that democracy wouldn't work in China, that he wanted that he thought that a single party state was better for China's culture, China in general. Why do you think that is, and what was Deng's reasoning as to why it would not work in China?
I think that China, from the time of the Opium War, had such chaos up till 1949 that it was such a mess, and there were so many millions of people who were roving and killed, and there was no stable power, so they did not have the underlying stability that permitted economic progress, and that it was very hard to get the unity in 49, and that had again been destroyed in the Cultural Revolution, that the place had come apart, and it was so chaotic. I think in the West, we're blessed by having democratic systems which are very stable and solid. Even during our Vietnam War, there was no real worry that these people who opposed our policy, even though they're demonstrating, they were not trying to overthrow our government. But in China, there was a real worry that some of these people were really trying to overthrow the government. And I think that the Communist Party, after all, in killing off landlords and in some of the policies of the Great Leap Forward, there were a lot of people who were very much opposed and really hoped the Communist Party would fall. And that under that kind of system, you'd need a tighter order. Deng said on 2 or 3 occasions that the kind of political system you have and political reform depends on the political situation in the country. I don't think Deng opposed democracy. He said several times, he used the term democracy favorably. And in 1978, when he was coming to power, a lot of people were writing stuff on the wall, and it was called Democracy Wall. And he supported it for about 4 months until the mood became especially critical of the party. He felt he had to clamp down at that point. So I think it was his judgment about the political situation. It's very interesting to compare him and Hu Yaobang. Hu Yaobang in the 50s had been in charge of the Youth League, while Deng was in charge of the party. Hu Yaobang's job in the Youth League was to try to give encouragement to young people, to give them enthusiasm. Deng's charge of the party, the buck stopped there. He had final responsibility for keeping order in the country. And he felt that he couldn't run the risk of having the country fall apart again. So I think that's the way he looked at it. I can't. Yes.
I'd like to take advantage of your knowledge of Japan as well as China and ask you to compare China's, after the Cultural Revolution, Deng's encouragement of Chinese to go out overseas and learn from other countries with Japan's similar effort during the Meiji Restoration. Both went out to other countries to look what they could learn, took back lessons, but didn't absorb them 100%. So how would you compare the two?
Well, as a matter of fact, once I saw about the Gumu trip, immediately what popped in my mind was the Iwakura mission in the Meiji Japan. And the Meiji Japan, for 21 months, they sent a similar kind of group around to the United States, some 15 different countries, and they selected the people the same way that Deng selected the people for the Gumu trip. And they were to come back and to have major responsibilities at that time. I think for one thing, at the Meiji period, the pace of development was much slower. They didn't have to worry about immediate invasion from other countries. And Deng was very worried in the fall of 1978 about potential encirclement by the Soviet Union. And he was upset when Vietnam was about ready to invade Cambodia. So I think the outside immediate time pressure under Deng was much greater. Also, by the time Deng came along, he had the example of Japan, and even South Korea and Taiwan, that had begun to modernize with a kind of, all of them had kind of an authoritarian leadership and learning from other countries. I think another difference was that Deng had so many overseas Chinese that he could draw on, that he could have them serve as advisors. And Japan didn't have anything comparable, so they had to invite in foreign specialists. But Deng invited in foreign specialists in a much huger way because information technology was so much more advanced in Deng's days in the beginning of Meiji that they could use all kind of information, new information technology, and much more contact in a much bigger, broader way. China being so huge, they went into all parts of China. It wasn't just the small group of foreigners who came to be teachers, as in Meiji Japan. It was just massive numbers of business educators, people from all fields who were admitted. So those are, I would say, are some of the major differences. Yes?
Hollis Johnson. Who was the next leader after Deng died, and did he lead the country the same way as Deng?
That's a very good question. In one of the pictures right toward the end, I show this person, Yang Zhenning, who was standing behind him in 1992. And Deng selected him right after 89 to be the leader. At the time of 89, he had planned to have a person named Chaozhu be the next leader. But Zhao was not willing to impose martial order. And there were a lot of people who felt that he had made some very bad mistakes with inflation in 1988. So they needed a new leader right after Tiananmen. Deng wanted to have the leader ready so that as soon as they brought in the troops, they would have a new leader to take over right away. He also wanted a leader who would not be implicated in the June 4th crackdown. So somebody like Li Peng, who a lot of people thought might have been the next leader, had been so closely involved in the June 4th crackdown that if he wanted to start a new leaf and try to get the new the youth of China working with a new leader, that would be hopeless. And so he brought somebody from Shanghai, Jiang Zemin, who is well known. He and several other leaders from Beijing, Li Xianyan and Chen Yun, spent winter vacation in Shanghai, usually January, for the several years before 1989. So they all knew him very well. So although his name was not so well known to the outside world at that point, he was very well known to the top leaders, and they felt that he combined a deep understanding of the outside world, a willingness to play reform role, with ability to be tough. And so Deng selected him to be the next leader. Yes.
I'm Dan Li Lan from Anscott College, and my question is adding to the previous question about Chinese democracy. What do you think is the influence of Deng's response to Tiananmen to China's contemporary path to democracy right now? Thank you.
I think that the crackdown pulled back the progress. I think that in 1986, Chaozhu was able to carry on broad discussions about political reform, and they had very big talks about that. And the mood seemed to be one that would begin to make progress. But when demonstrations occurred in 1989, I think Deng felt he had to come back and tighten up. So I think that the impact was such as to hold back the progress for several years. And I think it wasn't until the mid-1990s that they were able to move ahead a little forward and begin to open up things again. I think that from the point of view of the leaders of Beijing, the question is, can they hold the country together? And if there's enough confidence that they can hold it together without using the military, of course, they're very pleased. I think right now, again, they're very tense. And I'm afraid that the mood is one where the top leaders are cracking down again. We don't yet know what's going to happen over the next couple of years, but I think if Xi Jinping, who's just coming to the United States now, is able to establish order and things seem to be going pretty well, that he might be willing to move ahead. His father, Xi Jinping, had been a very progressive person who supported Hu Yaobang and who played a very key role in the opening up of Guangdong and Shenzhen. And so I think it's possible that if he feels that things are going fairly smoothly and demonstrations under control, that he might be willing to again pursue further steps toward democratization. Yes. Oh.
What do you think about seek truth from facts and its relation to Deng-era communist ideology?
Deng did not think the ideology was that important. In the Yan'an period in the 1940s, when Mao was developing, writing various theoretical articles, many of the people who were in Yan'an, who were more removed from the front lines of the battle, could think about big philosophical, historical issues. Deng at that time was on the front lines, and it was a wartime, situation where he had to continue to think about the next battle. So he didn't really have time to worry that much about ideology. I think he was very smart in the way he managed the transition. If he had said, ideology is no use, or Mao Zedong's thought is not really useful anymore, there would have been a conservative fight that would have made a huge mess. What he said was, seek truth from facts. And even more, he said, it doesn't matter if the cat's black or white, as long as it catches the mouse, 老鼠. And what he meant by that was, if Mao's ideology works, wonderful, follow it. But it meant also, if Mao's ideology didn't work, you got to find something that works. So it was a roundabout way, without hitting head-on and coming to head-on's clash with the ideologues, to say in effect that ideology isn't that important. You must seek truth from facts, and you must try what works. Now, that's very much consistent with Deng throughout his life. He was always a very pragmatic person, and he was given the frontline responsibility. Mao might have been chairman of the board, but Deng was chief executive officer. He had to deal with the problems day by day. Yes?
Hi, Dr. Vogel. I have a question regarding Deng Xiaoping's return after he was purged twice from the party. So could you just briefly shed some light on the internal workings of the party? Do larger forces summon him back and give him his authority back again, or what's going on?
In 1977, you mean?
Yes, thanks.
Of course, Hua Guofeng, who was Mao's successor, had taken responsibility for arresting the Gang of Four. So Hua Guofeng had already gotten rid of the most radical groups in the society. And I think personally it's unfair to say that Deng really began opening. Of course, I'm writing about Deng, but Chinese history writing always praises the winner, and the winner is seen to be virtuous and knowledgeable and correct, and the loser is usually seen to be bad and unimportant. So I think in official writings, Deng, the emphasis on how Deng's wonderful leadership has obscured the positive role that Hua Guofeng played in 1976 and 77. I think, in fact, Hua Guofeng was willing to make lots of changes for Mao. He one time had to make a speech that got to be known as the two whatevers, where he wanted to prove that he was following Mao because his only base of authority was that he was selected by Mao. But I think that Hua Guofeng, in fact, was encouraging people to go to abroad. He was encouraging a greater opening of the economy, and he had gotten rid of the radicals connected with Mao, including Mao's wife, and Mao would not have supported that. Mao wanted his wife to stay active, and Hua got rid of her. So I think that there was already very considerable support for moving ahead that was not just from Deng. The other dynamic, I think, is that a lot of people in the party had been promoted during the Cultural Revolution. They tend to be more radical. And a lot of the senior authorities in the party had been pushed aside in 1976, but even Mao had begun to allow them to come back. So the people who put Deng in authority in December 78 were largely those people who had come back. When the great proletarian cultural revolution, Mao had promoted Lin Biao, and a lot of army people had been promoted. But in 71, when Lin crashed, then gradually those army people were pushed aside. So the only people they had really to take responsible leadership position were those old cadres. So Mao had allowed a lot of those old cadres to come back. And they were very much against those people who had risen in the Cultural Revolution. They had much more experience. They knew how to run things. And Deng relied much more on them. And they were the ones who supported his rise in the fall of 1978. I can't see some of the people back there because of the light, but are there more hands back there? Good. Here's a mic.
Having to do with the relationship between Deng and Mao and Zhou Enlai, what an extraordinary trio, you might say. And you present Zhou as Deng's mentor. And yet, Zhou was part of the leadership that sends Deng down. And Zhou remains loyal to Mao throughout. How do you really characterize the relationship there, particularly Zhou Enlai and Deng Xiaoping?
again, we don't have all the records we'd like to have to answer that question. There is a person, as you know, in the United States, Gao Wenquan, who was in charge of the Zhou Enlai archives in Beijing for many years and came out to the West and then wrote a book on Zhou Enlai. And he has as much evidence as anybody, and he feels that there was quite a bit of tension between Deng and Zhou Enlai, perhaps in the mid-50s. It's a very complicated, close relationship, I think, between those three people. And I wish I had more data, but I have enough background in psychology to have some guesses. And my guess is like this, that Mao was so powerful and so overwhelming, and Zhou Enlai was in such difficulty in the 30s when he was criticized, that he was never confident that he could really take over, and he knew that if he wanted to survive, he had to be 200% loyal to Mao. And he tried to do everything he could to be loyal to Mao. And he was not, after that, the kind of person who would be the number one leader. He had not run things on his own. He was the maiden or the premier under Mao. So I think that Deng then came in as much, in some ways, more like Mao than Zhou. He was more of a confident, a person who took charge, who could run things. And even though there was a lot of tension between the two during the Cultural Revolution, when Deng Xiaoping was purged and Zhou Enlai was allowed to stay on and was Mao's right-hand man during the Cultural Revolution, and played a very complicated, ambivalent role where he got rid of a lot of people that Mao wanted to get rid of and tried to help others to the extent that he could under Mao's umbrella. But I think that Zhou Enlai and Deng, because they knew each other in France, and because Zhou Enlai had served in the underground in Shanghai in the 30s, and Deng had served under him and lived next door to him, and in Beijing in the 50s, when Zhou was premier and Deng was general secretary, they worked very closely together. And I think that after 73, when it was clear to Zhou Enlai that he was not going to be in charge, that he realized that for the good of the country, that he could only rely on Deng Xiaoping. He was the best person to succeed him in doing foreign relations. And Deng visited Zhou Enlai in the hospital many times after that. And Mao never visited Zhou Enlai. Mao was more mobile, but never visited Zhou Enlai in the hospital. And Deng went often, and I think there's no question he got advice during that time. And in January 76, when Zhou Enlai died, Deng was the one chosen to give the eulogy at Zhou Enlai's death. And he was reported to be in tears at that time, something that is not often occurred in Deng's history. So I think there was a very deep, at the end, the last 2 or 3 years especially, a deep positive relationship and cooperation between the two.
Thanks. Could you go back a little further in history and tell us a little bit about how you developed your own interests in modern Chinese history, and just a little bit of that, your own background in that? I have an unusual background. My PhD was in sociology with an department called Social Relations at Harvard, which include clinical social psych and social anthropology. And my PhD thesis was on the American family that had nothing to do with Asia. And then after I finished that, one of my teachers says, "Young man, you're so provincial. You've never been out of the country. And if you want to work on American society, you ought to go to a very different country with a different culture." And so she helped me get a couple-year grant to Japan. When I came back from that, I was still working on family and mental health. When I went to visit one teacher in Harvard, who said Harvard just received some money and they wanted to get a sociologist on China, and they didn't have anybody in mind. And since I'd been a Harvard PhD and had been in Asia at least, would I be interested in a 3-year fellowship to study Chinese language, history, and so forth? And I thought about it for 24 hours and said yes. And so Erwin Hyatt and I were beginning Chinese in the fall of 1960, and I just kept learning ever since. That my problem is different than most. I got promoted too quick and had responsibilities and had to keep studying while I was teaching. And people who study France or Europe, or now people who study China now, learn as undergraduates, they learn as a language, and they know a lot about history. In my 3-year postdoc, I read a lot about Chinese history, but I had to keep studying. So I become a kind of a non-stop student, and I still consider myself a student, and I still got a lot to learn about Chinese history.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.